So before we get started, I want to read I was forwarded this by one of our members. They found this from a preacher who had posted it on Facebook in response to somebody. I guess it was originally part of maybe an article or something, but I guess it's a preacher. He receives questions and then he answers them in like newsletter and in Facebook and that sort of thing. And because Debbie last week, or maybe it was the week before last, asked about whether or not there was any kind of like a paper trail, for lack of a better phrase, that we can trace the Church of Christ all the way through from the first century on up to today. And we talked about the fact that we can see the evidence of the Church of Christ as it existed, but that an actual paper trail or references to the Church of Christ, there aren't all of those all the way through all of the centuries. And so this was sent to me kind of as a kind of an interesting little tidbit, and I thought it was interesting too, and I wanted to share it with everybody. Often we hear people maintain that the Church of Christ had its beginning with the Campbells, Thomas and his son Alexander. That's one of the things we talked about, that some people make that assumption that we're called Campbellites, who came to the United States in the early 1800s. However, documentary research of Dr. Robinson, principal of Overdale College in Birmingham, England, shows the following, and this is quoted from Dr. Robinson. In the Furness district of Lancashire, in northwest England, there existed in 1669, during the reign of Charles II, a group of 8 churches of Christ. Most of them are not now in existence. An old minute book has been found on the year 1669, and it shows that they called themselves by the name of the Church of Christ, practiced baptism by immersion, celebrated the Lord's Supper each Lord's Day, and had elders and deacons. There was also a Church of Christ in Dungannon, Ireland, in 1804, and in Allington, Dinginshire, in 1735, John Davis, a young preacher in the Fife district of Scotland, was preaching New Testament Christianity 25 years before Thomas Campbell was born. The Church of Christ was promised by Jesus Christ. It began on Pentecost and has existed since that day. In view of these facts, how could anyone conclude that the churches of Christ today are followers of a man, Alexander Campbell? Some, because of prejudice, accuse members of the Lord's church today of being Campbellites. This really is sad, because there is not a doctrine or practice engaged in by the Lord's church that originated with Alexander Campbell, nor with any other man. Anywhere in this world that people follow the teaching of Christ found in the New Testament, they are a congregation of the New Testament church. After all, Jesus left us a book of instructions plain enough to be followed. If we follow that guide, the will be what he wants it to be. And so we claim nothing more nor less than the church of the New Testament. And this is from Virgil Hale from the Southwest Church of Christ in Austin, Texas. I think I've heard of the Southwest Church of Christ. I haven't heard of Virgil Hale before. But I guess there's some kind of newsletter or something, the Southwesterner, where he takes questions like that and kind of addresses things. And there was another one that he posted from a man named Jerry, who asked the question, did the true church exist during the centuries after the death of the apostles? And so he responds, Dear Jerry, if you're looking for a national or international organization wearing the name Church of Christ and meeting publicly in church buildings such as we know, the answer is no. After the first century, we don't see that. But if you are looking for people who lived and worshiped according to the teachings of Christ, the answer is yes. The apostles predicted that apostasy was coming. You see that in Acts chapter 20, 1 Timothy chapter 4. By the 4th century, apostasy was widespread. The corrupt church, and by saying corrupt church, he's talking about those who have started to go on to the Catholic Church and that sort of thing, did not hesitate to persecute those who dared to dissent from their teaching and practice. When the apostasy was full grown, it was what we now know as the Roman Catholic Church. So great was its power and so oppressive its tyranny that any who dared to hold to the ancient faith of the apostles had to go, quote unquote, underground with their faith or perish at the hands of the dominant church. In the book of Revelation, John talks about the church and talks about being persecuted and so forth. It's Jesus talking about it, and John records it. Dissenting groups, being small and persecuted, did not gain a notable place in the history of the church. The corrupt church, again, reading that as the Catholic Church, being dominant, preserved her diatribes against the dissenters. As is common, they were maligned and misrepresented on every occasion. From the writings of their enemies, it is virtually impossible to know for sure what they believed, taught, and practiced. In recent years, researchers have been able to unearth some bits of information that throw more light on these independent churches. Some among the Puritans and Separatists in England seem to have held views similar to modern-day churches of Christ. In Europe, there was a numerous back to the Bible movement called by their enemies Anabaptists. And on the two timelines, the one that we had in our notes, as well as the one on the back table that we had, the web diagrams, Anabaptists were kind of considered a Protestant formation of themselves. But what Anabaptists, does anybody know what an Anabaptist was? What it literally meant? Not Baptist, yeah, that's true. Anabaptists literally were re-baptizers. Okay, not that they called themselves Anabaptists. The Catholic Church called these people Anabaptists. So why would the Catholic Church call them re-baptizers? They baptized their children at birth. The Catholic Church did. And so when these people went around baptizing people for the proper reason, the Catholic Church labeled them Anabaptists in a derogatory way, or being heretical, that they should be baptized after they come of age. So that's where the term Anabaptist comes from. The earliest traces of this movement are found in the 14th century. They were thoroughly committed to the idea of restoring the original faith, worship, and practice of the Apostolic Church. The Anabaptists were hated and persecuted by Catholics and Lutherans and Calvinists. Thousands of them died for their faith. Those believers who sought to be faithful to the teaching of Christ and his apostles labored under the most difficult circumstances. Most were poor, they were persecuted unto death, their opportunities for advanced education were very limited. And so he goes on to describe kind of some of the type of life that they had to live in those types of times. Then he says they lived in a day of prevailing ignorance and superstition. This they had to overcome as they sought to know to do God's will. Books of sound teaching were virtually non-existent. Tools for research and study, which we take for granted, were unavailable to them. And so it made it difficult for people to understand the truth, and yet basically what he does is commend these people for actually having the fortitude and the wherewithal to learn the truth, first of all, and then to actually follow it. And then this last part I thought was kind of a neat little piece as well. He says, be reminded that our standing before God does not depend on our ability to trace a line of churches of Christ back through history to the apostles. He's not saying that there isn't one. Obviously there is. But our ability to actually have evidence of a paper trail of churches of Christ non-interrupted all the way back to the first century. So our standing before God doesn't depend on having that type of evidence. The gospel is the seed of Christ's kingdom. In any place on earth, when an honest soul hears the gospel message, believes and is baptized, he is saved and added to the true church. And so that's kind of what that part of that post was about. But I thought that was really interesting. I hadn't heard, like I said, when Debbie first mentioned it, I mentioned that there was a book that has been published, although I don't know what the name of it is, that does attempt to kind of look back through history, more so at the evidence of the Church of Christ and the true gospel being taught despite the threats from the Catholic Church going all the way back to the 1st and 2nd centuries. But that in terms of a paper trail, there really isn't any. So this is actually the first I've heard about these churches in 1669, that there were 8 churches of Christ. And this was before the Reformation really took place. This was really kind of, this was in and around that time period where the Church of England had come about. That's what really prompted the Reformation, was the Church of England breaking off from the Roman Catholic Church. But as of 1669, the Campbells weren't around yet. So to say that the Church of Christ started with Alexander Campbell and his son Thomas, that doesn't make any sense if the Churches of Christ existed before those men did. So it just goes to show and to reemphasize and to reiterate the fact that the Churches of Christ have always existed since Christ created the church on the day of Pentecost through his apostles. So any thoughts on that? Because I thought that was really interesting and kind of, encouraging. You read stuff like that and you say, all right, well, that just reinforces my belief and my faith that the Church of Christ has always been here for the last 2,000 years. Any thoughts or comments on that? All right. So we are in the process of talking about a little bit about the Catholic Church. And we have been discussing Catholicism's basis for apostolic succession, their belief that Peter was the first pope, the fact that Rome was founded on the authority of Peter and Paul. And so we've kind of been discussing this a little bit. And so this is where we stopped off last week that I want to pick up. The tradition that links Peter with Rome is, quote, early and unrivaled. And the reason I included this in here, because this is according to a Catholic source, that this is what they're recording. Put that there on the heels of noticing how even experts in the Catholic Church question tradition and linking Peter with Rome. Aside from the fact that he was supposed to be killed in Rome, aside from that, the tradition linking Peter to Rome that they're claiming has to do with the church in Rome, not that he was killed in Rome. History suggests certainly that Peter was, along with Paul, killed in Rome, certainly. About 2 years after Paul was killed, Peter was killed. But in terms of actually having been in Rome and, first of all, even visiting the church in Rome, much less being a member or an elder, much less a pope for that matter, there's no evidence. There's no evidence of that. Not to say that he couldn't have been at one time either in Rome to visit, or for that matter, maybe he at some point did go to Rome and become a member there, maybe even elder. I'm not saying that that's not possible. But the fact that there's no evidence of that makes this claim that it's early and unrivaled suspect. Makes it a little bit of a suspect claim. In the first years of the 2nd century, so this is the 100s to 150-ish or so, Ignatius of Antioch implies that Peter and Paul had special authority over the Roman Church. Now remember, we talked about the Founding Fathers and some of their writings, and how most of their writings we no longer have in existence. We have to trust the writings of other men like Irenaeus and Eusebius, who tell us what these men said and what they believed. So it's interesting that, remember we talked about Ignatius and we talked about Clement I and how these men, based on what we actually have, that is at least to be believed was written by them, that there's nothing necessarily out of step with the Gospels. In fact, for the most part, they just quote the Gospel. But notice this, that supposedly Ignatius of Antioch implies that Peter and Paul had special authority over the Roman Church. This implication has been assumed by biased historians. Because when you actually go and you read what Ignatius himself wrote, there is no mention of Peter and Paul as having special authority in Rome. None. Okay, that's been assumed, and the basis for that assumption is basically everything that we have from Eusebius. And we're going to talk more about Eusebius in a minute. Irenaeus of Lyons, remember we talked about Irenaeus a little bit also of the 2nd century, later in about the second half, mid-second half, 2nd century, believed that Peter and Paul had been the founders of the church in Rome and had appointed Linus as bishop. Okay, now Irenaeus supposedly records this, again recorded or claimed to be copied or whatever by Eusebius. But as we've already seen, Irenaeus' testimony is itself questionable at best. Irenaeus was a millennialist or premillennialist. He believed in a 1,000-year reign, at least according to the evidence we have, not necessarily by any writings he has given, but based on what's been said about him. And much of what he supposedly wrote or said no longer exists separately from the recordings of Eusebius. And we've been talking a lot about Eusebius. He came on the scene and was having writings and so forth in the early 4th century, so 320s-ish is about when a lot of the writings came on the scene. And his bias for the Catholic papacy is clear. In fact, that's not just coming from me, as we'll note here in a little bit. That's coming from historical sources as well, saying Eusebius is a little biased in the stuff that he writes. So that's saying something if they're saying that. Dionysius of Corinth also serves as a witness to the tradition. But here's what's interesting. As important a cog as Dionysius is in the argument that Peter and Paul were key components of the church in Rome, and they assigned Linus to be the first or the second pope after Peter, the only place we have any information about this Dionysius is through Eusebius. No other source ever records anything about Dionysius, just Eusebius. There is no other source for his existence or what he taught. So we basically have to take Eusebius' word, first of all, that this Dionysius existed in the first place, much less that he was a witness to the fact that Peter and Paul established the church in Rome and set up Linus as the next pope. The traditional narrative, anything through that. Okay, because the majority of what we have in terms of actual text that lends any credence whatsoever to Paul or Peter, the suggestion that they were involved in the Church of Rome, or that there were any kind of a pope, or as we've been noticing, episcopal papacy being established. Polity. Papacy is the lineage of the popes. Polity is the hierarchy of the elders, bishops, and archbishops, and all that stuff. All of that basically comes from Eusebius. And so everything's looked backward through that lens of supporting this early way of doing things. Therefore, it's assumed that the apostles must have done it this way. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say, let's say for a moment, okay, let's remove any benefit of doubt for these church fathers. Let's say they were all off, and they all were in favor of having a single elder over each church and having this archbishop diocese and popes in Rome. Let's say even going back to Clement and Ignatius, that they were all wrong. Does that in any way offer authority for what the New Testament church was? Or what it should be? Do those men have the authority to change what Jesus established through his apostles? Does it change the commands and the approved example that we have in the New Testament? So even removing the benefit of doubt from these men, which I try to give them all benefit of the doubt, because I do believe that they've gotten a bad rap in terms of history, because it's been perceived and recorded through a certain lens, a biased lens. That being the case, even if they're right, Clement and Ignatius and all these men like Dionysius, it doesn't matter. It doesn't change the fact that the New Testament church was established a certain way, and that can't just be changed. And there's no evidence in the New Testament that says that it could. Once it's said. Even Paul says, if I or an angel from heaven speak anything else than you've already received, let him be accursed. It doesn't matter. Even Paul himself put limits on what he could do as an apostle. It can't be changed. So it's flimsy at best, this establishment of apostolic succession. Thoughts or comments through that so far? The traditional narrative starts with Peter being consecrated by Jesus, followed by Peter traveling to Rome sometime after Pentecost, founding a church there, serving as its first bishop, and consecrating Linus as bishop, thus starting the line of popes from whom Francis I is the current successor. Even that is a little, first of all, not even just based on assumption. There is no evidence for it. None. This is the traditional narrative. It starts with all of this, and it's just dreamed up. Because we know that as of Acts chapter 15, where was Peter? As of Acts 15, where was Peter? In Jerusalem. And Paul says, how many years was it from the time that he was converted in Damascus by being baptized to the time he went down to or up to Jerusalem in Galatians 2? How many years does he say it was? 14. 14 years. You were close. 14 years. Okay? So even this narrative doesn't fit with what we read in the New Testament. Because it says sometime after Pentecost. Well, it had to have been at least 14 years. At the very least. Because Peter was not only a member, it's still in Jerusalem, but there's some suggestion that given it was 14 years, this would have been pretty close to the time of the writing of 1st and 2nd Peter. I mean, you're getting fairly close into that mid-50s-ish based on some estimates. So depending on how long this was, you're talking about a very short turnaround for him to then go to Rome. He certainly couldn't have set up the church in Rome because Paul would have already written or was in the process of writing that at that time in Acts chapter 15. So the timeline doesn't fit. It doesn't make sense for that. This narrative is often related in histories of the Catholic Church. Elements of this traditional narrative agree with the surviving historical evidence, which includes the writings of several early church fathers, among them, quote, Pope Clement I, and some archaeological evidence. Notice notice, and again, this is coming from a Catholic source, notice elements of this traditional narrative. I love that part. Not the narrative as a whole, elements. Well, yeah, elements that Peter was an apostle, that there was a church established in Rome, that Linus perhaps served as an elder. There is some evidence for that. Not that he was ever considered a single bishop, but perhaps as an elder, sure. But in terms of the actual narrative, there is no surviving historical evidence, much less archaeological evidence, that in any way supports the narrative itself. Elements, sure, not the narrative. And again, as I mentioned, quote-unquote, Pope Clement I, his writings that have been considered authentic are contrary to the writings that most historians all agree have been written in his name. Those writings are the ones that suggest or confirm this narrative, not the ones that are considered authentic. So, while some revisionist history type of thing, while some historians of Christianity assert that the Catholic Church can be traced to Jesus' consecration of Peter, we talked about that, on this rock I'll build my church, that thing. Others argue that Jesus did not found a church in his lifetime, but provided a framework of beliefs. Technically, from a purely definition point of view, I would agree with that, in that the church did not exist before Jesus died. The church existed after. It came into being after he died on the day of Pentecost. That's true. Jesus did provide teachings that provided a refinement of what had already been taught under the old law. Okay, and of course, many of that, this is what the law says, but I say unto you. Okay, so it's not really changing the law, it's actually kind of being more refined in terms of looking at the heart and the spirit and so forth than just the actions. So, okay. But notice this. Other historians disagree with the traditional view that the papacy originated with Peter, instead asserting that the papal office developed at an unspecified date before the mid-150s and could possibly have been superimposed by the traditional narrative upon the primitive church. I thought that was really interesting. The fact that there are some historians that when they look at it, they say there's no evidence to suggest that Peter was the first pope. And even going as far as Linus, or even maybe the next one or two, quote-unquote, popes, may have just been elders or bishops in the church at Rome, not popes. And so this idea that the papal office or that structure of organization, that hierarchy of authority, was superimposed by the traditional narrative. That is to say that the Catholic Church made up this narrative. They came up with this way of looking at things and then superimposed it on the past, thus defining quote-unquote primitive church. But they don't mean primitive as if it's a bad thing. They mean the early church, the first century church. That this is the type of lens or pattern that they've placed on viewing the primitive church based on the narrative they want it to be. Does that make sense? And I thought that was really interesting because I agree with that. Okay, now mid-150s, that's just kind of an arbitrary date in that the earliest actual supported records of an actual Pope so-and-so don't happen until the late 100s, around 200 AD. Remember we talked about around 220, the Catholic Church, at least in form, existed, and we're talking about Roman Catholic, in form existed. Now in teaching and in the way we think of it today, didn't really come into that form until the late 200s. But as of 220, its form was in place. So it makes sense that there would have been one elder, and of course with the importance that some of the early Christians erroneously may have placed on Rome as being the death place of Peter and Paul, could have taken on certain importance. I could see that happening, and the evolution of that thought means is that the elder in Rome must be more important than all the other elders of the other churches, single elders over these churches. So he's going to be the main elder. We'll call him the Pope. Okay? So I could see that evolution taking place. Any thought through that so far? The only part of this narrative that is supported directly by the Scriptures is the, and again, supposedly being improperly interpreted, consecration of Peter, which I thought that was in and of itself an astounding admission that the only scriptural authority upon which the Catholic Church bases any of this is the, again, misinterpreted event of Jesus, quote-unquote, consecrating Peter. However, elements of the rest of the narrative are attested to in the writings of church fathers such as Ignatius. Okay? And so I included this in here because when I was reading through this in the source, I said, all right, so what you're saying to is that all the other elements of this narrative was in place no later than the 120s or 130s, because that's when Ignatius was around. That's when he was doing his writings. So I'm curious to see what Ignatius actually wrote that suggests to historians that this is when the narrative was really in place. So I went back to a lot of Ignatius' own writings and looked some of this up. Listen to this. The 7 epistles preserved under the name of Ignatius are generally considered authentic, since they were mentioned by the historian Eusebius in the first half of the 4th century. That's in the 300s to 350. Ever since the Protestant Reformation, the authenticity of all the Ignatian epistles has come under intense scrutiny. John Calvin called the epistles rubbish published under Ignatius' name. Protestants have tended to want to deny the authenticity of the epistles because they seem to attest to the existence of a monarchical episcopate in the 2nd century. Monarchical meaning the sense of the Pope kind of as the king and then going forward down from there. In 1886, Presbyterian minister and church historian William Killen published an essay extensively arguing that none of the epistles attributed to Ignatius is authentic. Instead, he argued that Calixtus, Bishop of Rome, and we mentioned this before when we talked about Ignatius, forged the letters around, guess what, 220 AD to garner support for a monarchical episcopate. Okay, and remember we're talking about that form kind of being established as of 220, and that seems to kind of be the center period of time that we're talking about of this coalition establishing the popes and the archbishops and the dioceses and all that stuff. Modeling the renowned Saint Ignatius after his own life to give precedent for his own authority. And that comes from the source regarding Calixtus, or regarding Killen about Calixtus, the Bishop of Rome. Irenaeus, almost everything we know about Irenaeus comes from Eusebius, including even some of his supposed writings. Okay, because Eusebius basically says, hey, we don't have these writings anymore. Here's what he said. And so Eusebius says that he's quoting Irenaeus and what Irenaeus wrote. But we have to believe Eusebius on that. And Dionysius of Corinth, again, Eusebius only. Largely as a result of a challenge to this narrative initiated by Alfred Loisy, some theologians have challenged the historicity of the traditional narrative, resulting in a less literal interpretation of the church's founding by Jesus and less specific claims about the historical foundations and transmission of the patrine primacy in the church's early years. All to say that they're questioning that things happened the way the Catholic Church says they happened. They're questioning that Jesus actually established his church on Peter, because the church wasn't established, first of all, on Peter, much less it wasn't established while Jesus was alive. But you see, that's part of the argument, is that Jesus established at least the authority of his church in Peter. In that moment that he says, upon you, Peter, is what I'm going to build my church. That's how the Catholics, that's how they read that. But this is the questioning of that process, even to the point that the transmission of the primacy, the authority through Peter in the church's early years, they're questioning that because there's no evidence for it. There's only this narrative that has been repeated for generations. Some historians have also challenged the traditional narrative of Peter's role in the early Roman church because there's no evidence for it. Okay, there's no evidence that Peter was ever in Rome as a member of the church in Rome. There is that he was killed in Rome, but that's it. So I thought a lot of that was really interesting. And when you go back and you kind of look up, and all of these writings are available online, y'all. If anybody ever wants to Google them or look them up, you can look up the writings, supposed writings of Clement, of Ignatius, of Irenaeus, of Eusebius. You can read them all yourself, of what we have of them. And when you go back and you read what Ignatius is supposed to have said, vast majority of it, in fact, as far as what I could find, all of it, I'm not going to say all of it because I don't know that for a fact, but the majority of it all comes from Eusebius. that Eusebius says, Ignatius said, this is the way things were. So really, to a certain extent, the entire foundation or traditional narrative that the Catholic Church has based its founding upon is through the lens of one man. That's it. Eusebius, everything else, remember it says elements of, okay? So they take all these scattered pieces and they match it, and really what Eusebius did was Eusebius matched it into a certain narrative to provide a foundation to build what they were wanting to build or to establish authority for what they'd already built. And now today, it's accepted, or at least was, it's being more questioned more and more, but it's accepted based on one man, really. If Eusebius' writings didn't exist, the Catholic Church, at least in its current form, might not exist. Or at least it would not necessarily maybe have the as much influence as it has had in the past. Okay? Because they all go back to Peter. See, we can trace ourselves back to Peter. Well, if Eusebius' writing didn't exist, you would have a gap from the 100s-ish, 120s, to 320. Okay? You'd have a gap because there's very little else. The majority of the Catholic Church's history is what Eusebius has written. Kind of interesting. Any thoughts through that so far? And do we see also the wisdom of God? About how many, let me rephrase this a different way. Why don't we have one author over the Bible? Well, human author, human hand, writer. Just, huh? Okay, so we've got a span of at least 1,500 years covering Genesis, the writing of Genesis by Moses, the recording of it, through Revelation, okay, in the late 90s AD. About 1,500 years worth, at least, of history written by dozens of individuals inspired by God, okay? Then you get to the New Testament specifically, okay? This is the one upon which we base our faith. And is the New Testament, the Gospels, the epistles, is all written by one person? I mean, we've got multiples. We've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. We've got Peter. We've got Paul. We've got James. We've got John, or John again. We've got Hebrews. May have been John Mark. May have been Barnabas. Some people think it's Barnabas. Whoever it was. We've got Hebrews. What's the wisdom behind God's inspiring all of these different men to write these things, when it would have been easier to have one person do it? The one person, first of all, could be a focus of worship. That's for sure. Yeah, you could definitely guarantee that would have happened. What else?
Proves inspiration.
So, what is one of our arguments against the Mormon Church and its writings? It came from one man. And even those who claimed to have seen these golden plates that he dug up, 6 of the 8 recanted and were kicked out of the Mormon Church, and the last 2 were related to Joseph Smith. Those last 2 refused to recant, but they were related to Joseph Smith. So there's virtually no basis upon which to even support that belief. And one man did it. And yet millions of people believe in the Mormon faith. The wisdom of God in inspiring these different men, it goes to show the consistency, first of all, of the teaching, the harmony of all of it together. We looked at Sunday at James and Paul, how they both said something strictly contradictory. Paul says that Abraham was justified by faith. James says he was justified by works. But when we establish the context, we realize they're actually saying the exact same thing. They're just making 2 sides of the point. This harmony exists, and we can have faith and trust in the fact that all of these men were inspired of God, and they had the truth, and it's consistent all the way through. And for that matter, it's consistent with the prophecies and the character of Jehovah all the way to Genesis. And that goes to show that we put our faith not in one man or in one person who recorded the history of our faith, but rather we're putting our faith in something that was established, that was known by these individuals. Our eyes have seen, our hands have touched, John says in 1 John chapter 1. All right, side point there. Anything else through this part? The New Testament offers no proof that Jesus established the papacy. This is a good thing. This is a positive thing. The New Testament offers no proof. There's no evidence that Jesus established the papacy. That's the pope or the lineage of the popes, the apostolic, the authority of the succession of the popes, nor that he established Peter as the first bishop of Rome. The official documents of the Catholic Church do not apply to Peter the title of Bishop of Rome. I found that kind of interesting. The oldest manuscripts they have in terms of talking about Peter himself, there is no title, Bishop of Rome, applying it instead to the successor of Peter, talking about Linus, and presenting the Pope as Peter's successor in his relationship with the whole of the Catholic Church. It's interesting because the way they put it, technically speaking, Peter never was a pope. In essence, what they're saying, what even the Catholic sources technically are saying is that we call him the Pope because he was the first head of the church, but technically he was never called a pope. He was never called the Bishop of Rome. He was the one in whom all authority was placed by Jesus. So when he passed that off, technically Linus became the first pope. It's semantics to a certain extent, but that's what they're saying, is that this authority, ultimately, we don't have any authority in the Scriptures to prove this, so to be better safe than sorry, we're going to pass it on to the next person, for which there's no scriptural reference much at all. Linus is mentioned one time, if it's the same Linus. However, some present the church as linking Peter's primacy, his authority, with his being Bishop of Rome. Eamon Duffy says that the official Catholic Church position is that Jesus had essentially appointed Peter as the first pope, with universal primacy, universal authority, as Bishop of Rome. Some historians have challenged the view that Peter was bishop, as the term is now understood, of Rome. Of course, bishop has a completely different definition in people's minds today than it certainly had in the New Testament, and that's what's being described there. Whether or not he was even an elder, and that's really what he means, an elder in Rome, even that, there's no evidence for. Not that he couldn't have been, but there's just no evidence. While most scholars agree that Peter died in Rome, it is generally accepted that there was a Christian community in Rome before either Peter or Paul arrived there. And I believe that's very clear from the book of Romans. Okay, that letter to the Romans, there's not that it couldn't have been an apostle that established a church in Rome, but Peter doesn't reference any apostle there. Okay, there's no suggestion that any apostle had visited Rome, much less laid hands on for anybody who received miraculous gifts. And that's one of the things Paul mentions in Romans chapter 1 about him wanting to do when he goes there. So it gives the suggestion that there was no apostle that had ever gone to Rome. But the Catholic Church draws an analogy between Peter's seeming primacy among the 12 of the New Testament texts, such as Matthew 16, Luke 22, and John 21, and the position of the Pope among the Church's bishops, which I find very, very, well, if it weren't so heretical against the teachings of Christ, it would be kind of funny. Because if you look at Matthew 16, Luke 22, and John 21, even though, yes, Peter features prominently in those, what did Jesus kind of have to keep reminding his apostles, all of them? What did he have to keep telling them? Will there be one who's in charge of all of you? No, it will not be like this among you. So it goes contrary to the very teachings of Jesus that Peter's primacy among the 12 is shown when in fact Jesus taught against it. So it doesn't make sense for both to be true. And when we go to the text of Matthew 16, Luke 22, we'll do that a little bit next week, and John 21, it makes it clear that the context are not promoting a special authority of Peter. All right, we'll stop there. We will pick up talking about Peter a little bit more, and then as we go forward, we'll talk about 100 to 325 and going up to the First Council of Nicea. Thank you, everybody.